First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and thanks again for joining us. Today we are going to talk about tent stakes and how this often overlooked implement can really improve your impression while tenting on the old campground. Now, if you've been reenacting for any length of time, you're going to be all too familiar with the ubiquitous iron tent stake. Don't get me wrong, they work great, they last forever, but the typical Civil War soldier would not have burdened himself with the weight of carrying these things around. And in fact, if you refer to sources like Wilbur Fisk's Hard Marching Every Day, they talk about making camp items every time they were in camp for any length of time. They would use natural materials, locally sourced materials, which usually meant stripping barns and outbuildings for supplies. And so the soldiers were keenly aware of how critical being conscious about your weight was to surviving the hard marches during the Civil War. So if you were to just go off what's locally available at the end of a hard day, you're just going to look to the woods and make a wooden tent stake. I did a video on making these some time ago, and you can make them with pretty much anything: a pocket knife, an axe, a draw knife, whatever, and you can make them quickly. These can last quite a while depending on the variety of wood that you use, but the soldiers never intended to take these with them. They only had to last a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, and when they had to break camp and march again, these would almost always be left behind. They could also work a little easier and look for branches. And if you find a big branch with an offshoot branch, watch this and be amazed. You flip it upside down and you have a tent stake. You could trim this part off because you don't need it. And this branch becomes your rope hook, and then you just leave whatever remainder down here that you would need to go into the ground. And then when you had to march again, just leave them behind or burn them. Now, soldiers, if they knew they were going to be in a longer camp or there was just local resources available, they would take advantage of those resources and make camp items. This is an example of a field-made tent stake found in A.J. Hamler's book. This is made out of red oak that I got at the box store. And I detail how I made this using only hand tools at our website at secondusss.com. Now, there's something special about using the traditional methods to make things during the Civil War. And normally when we think about that, we think about hand sewing buttonholes and fretting over stitch length and trying to make the perfect dye for our wool. And small items like these get overlooked. By making something like this out of period tools, you actually get that tactile sense of history of the same saw marks and tool marks that they would have experienced as they tried to set up their camp. Since a lot of these materials would be stolen, if you had access to maybe some old barn wood that was strong enough to handle being made into a tent stake, that could be a really clever way to improve your impression with a field-made tent stake. Now, you could also get some commercially available tent pins, as they were also known. And Hamler also has an example of a turned tent pin. And this I made out of big leaf maple, and I made this on my spring pole lathe with 0 electricity. If you're new to turning, this is a pretty basic shape to start with. It's not bad. It doesn't take too long to make these. It might be an option that you want to go if you want something a little fancier. Just like I encourage people to bring back the dovetail into the hobby, I also encourage people to consider having some more turned items in the hobby. These would have, turned items were much more common than they are now. So that might be a way you want to go. Then you could do some more research like I did and come across the maple leaf. And this has just been something that's been coming across my desk a lot lately. Hamler talks about the maple leaf in his chapter on making tent slips. And as I did more and more research, I realized that I didn't find anything about the tent stakes from the maple leaf. And I thought this was really interesting. And you can see, you figure the tent slip's about 4 inches long. This would probably make these around 12 inches. But when I saw this, I thought, those look a lot like French World War I tent stakes, which I just so happen to have in my collection. So looking at the two pictures, I thought, well, if I made a template out of this one, I could do a few modifications and get to the maple leaf example real easily. So I started by tracing this onto a piece of 3/4 inch oak. I have the template for this exact tent stake on our website at secondusss.com. And so I traced it out, and then using only hand tools and a turning saw for the belly. A turning saw is just a really big coping saw. And I cut out the template, and I left out the hole because the maple leaf ones didn't have those. And so you have a belly here, and all the edges received a chamfer from my spoke shave. And as I studied the photos closely, I noticed that the maple leaf ones, I could tell right away, because if you look on the spine of the maple leaf ones, the spine got narrower, which told me that there was additional bevels cut out of the tent stake. So you have the bevel from the belly, and then I took a draw knife and I tapered the other two sides down to, maybe a little over 1/4 inch, keeping the back of the tent stake straight. So with a little bit of research and some ingenuity, I was able to bring back another piece of history to hold up a tent. These also remind me of a common style used with Sibley tents, but I'm not very familiar with the history of Sibley tents. So again, one more type of tent stake available that isn't one of these. Now you could make, these range from $2 plus each for these iron ones. This one cost me $0. This one cost me $0. This is just a stick, so that's free too. And even if you go with the oak varieties, you're figuring maybe $10 for 5 to 10 of them, depending on how big of a board you get and how expensive it is. So there are a lot of options to add some variety to your camping impression. Now, if you want additional information about tents and camping, I highly recommend this book. This is just on the shelter half. So if you're research minded and you want to know maybe way too much about shelter halves, this is the book for you. It goes into all sorts of reports, quartermaster reports, manufacturers, numbers produced, types of materials used, what years they were produced, types of string, types of hems, types of buttons, everything you could think of, different ways they were modified, different pole systems, the history of the shelter half is all contained in this very useful and small book. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Thanks so much, as always, for watching. Thanks for your wonderful questions and comments that you always post down below. Thanks for liking and subscribing and sharing up this video, and we'll see you next time.